In the name of God, in whom we live and move and have our being. Amen.
Amen.
Please be seated. Yesterday, on October 15th, the church celebrated the feast of St. Teresa of Avila. Teresa was a Spanish Carmelite nun who lived during the 1500s. She was a brilliant and feisty woman who lived during a time in history when brilliant and feisty women were not exactly all the rage, if you know what I mean. In spite of that fact, Teresa reformed the Carmelite order and the larger male-dominated Roman Catholic Church. She also established many new convents and monasteries for both men and women. She was the spiritual director of St. John of the Cross, who, along with Teresa herself, is counted among the greatest Christian mystics of all times. During a time and place in history when most women were not even allowed to obtain an education, and they certainly weren't allowed to flaunt their education, even if they had one, Teresa was lucky enough to have that education, and then she wrote profoundly deep and wise treatises on prayer and on mysticism. Her two greatest works are called The Interior Castle and The Way of Perfection. And you can still get very good translations of these works today. Particularly The Interior Castle is a treatise on prayer. Teresa was trying to teach the younger nuns and the sisters in her convents how to pray and how to enter into mystical relationship with God. Beautiful stuff. Though she writes about the most sublime levels of mystical prayer and union with God, Teresa insists that prayer is simply relationship with God. Nothing more and nothing less. And she teaches that relationship with God can be learned by looking at all the other relationships in our lives. Relationship with God can be learned by looking at our human relationships, especially the closest ones. Because we are, after all, made in the image and likeness of God. Because of her brilliance and far-reaching influence, Teresa was constantly under the scrutiny of the Spanish Inquisition. And her words are peppered with disclaimers that say things like, "But I am only a weak and ignorant woman. So if I err in any of my teaching, I defer to Mother Church." This woman really knew what she was talking about. And she knew how to avoid being burned at the stake as well. One of the other things that I particularly love about Teresa is that she didn't really do anything worth a hoot until she was at least 60 years old. She's one of my personal heroes. There's this great story told about a time when Teresa was riding a donkey through the Spanish countryside, traveling from monastery to monastery. And apparently it had been raining, and the road was very wet and very muddy. At one point, the poor donkey stumbled, and Teresa ended up on her butt in the mud. And she shook her fist at the sky, and she yelled at God, "If this is how you treat your friends, it's no wonder you have so few of them." Yes, ma'am, there was no messing with Teresa, not even for God. Who, by the way, she usually addressed with all dignity and deference as His Majesty. His Majesty, how beautiful. But there she was, sitting on her tush in the mud and shaking her fist at heaven and yelling at His Majesty. Now, some people would hear a story like that and consider it to be kind of blasphemous, kind of disrespectful and just, not appropriate in any way. But I think that a story like that shows us quite clearly that Teresa's relationship with God was real. It was close. It was deep and profound, genuine and intimate. And because it was all those things, it was very, very holy. Holy. Whether she was lost in the depths of ecstatic mystical prayer or shaking her fist at the sky and yelling, Teresa knew the one with whom she was one. This kind of raw and real intimacy is as old as our Judeo-Christian tradition. So remember the Old Testament story about Jacob wrestling with God? Not politely disagreeing, mind you, not arguing, not even shaking his fist at the sky. Jacob ended up rolling around on the ground in the dirt all night long, fighting with God. And he didn't stop wrestling with God until God blessed him. And God did indeed bless him. What an awesome story. What an awesome example of intimate relationship with God. So when was the last time that you wrestled with God? I know everyone's probably sitting there saying, oh no, I would never. I would never wrestle with God. That's so disrespectful and inappropriate. But you know what? I think you do wrestle with God all the time, because I know that I do. When was the last time that something happened that you didn't like? When was the last time something happened that you did not understand? When was the last time something happened that you did not particularly agree with? When was the last time someone or something was taken away from you? So now, when was the last time you wrestled with God? Was it yesterday? Last night? This morning? 10 minutes ago? Let me tell you something. If you're experiencing any of those things, and if you're not wrestling with God, you should start. You should start. Because when you do, God will use that struggle to bless you. God will use that wrestling match to draw you more deeply into intimacy with the one with whom you are one. In the gospel today, Jesus tells a story about stubborn persistence, which is just another kind of wrestling. A judge, who was one of the most powerful members of that society, is being quite literally harassed by a widow who was one of the poorest and weakest members of that society. And ultimately, she wins. She wins. She wins because she struggles with him, and she will not let him go until he grants her justice. She won't let him go until she blesses her. And the Bible says that Jesus uses this story to teach us how to pray. Jesus uses this story to teach us how to be in relationship with God, because prayer is relationship. There's no such thing as a real relationship in which there is no struggle. I've never had one. Have you? We can't do it that way with one another, and we can't do it that way with God. There's no such thing as an intimate relationship in which there is no wrestling, no struggle, no pain, no unfulfilled desire, no loss, no loneliness. Just as in our human relationships, especially the closest ones, our relationship with God has to be real in order to really count. It has to be real. It has to be intimate and genuine and real. And it can't be any of those things unless we are willing to be honest, excruciatingly honest with God and with ourselves. It can't be those things unless we are willing to wrestle with and struggle with and occasionally even shake our fists at God. But no worries, because God is big enough to take it. God's love for us is big enough to take anything that we can dish out. And besides, Jesus said it was okay. Because Jesus came to teach us how to be real and intimate with God. And that's why he told stories like today's gospel story about the judge and the widow. So, when was the last time that something happened to you that you didn't like? When was the last time something happened that you did not understand? When was the last time something happened to you that you did not particularly agree with? When was the last time someone or something was taken away from you? And so when was the last time that you wrestled with God? Was it yesterday? Last night? This morning? 10 minutes ago? Let me say it again. If you are experiencing any of those things, and if you're not wrestling with God, you should start. You should start. Because when you do, God will use that struggle to bless you. God will use that wrestling match to draw you more deeply into intimacy with the one with whom you are one. So, go ahead and get real with God. You have my permission. Get real with God, like Teresa of Avila, like Jacob, like the widow in today's gospel, and like Jesus.